Bob Dylan said. Electric is easy, try acoustic. And Jimi Hendrix said nothing. He just picked up the guitar and Dylan's world changed. The room was small. A third-floor apartment in Greenwich Village. February 1968. Outside, snow was falling on Bleecker Street, muffling the city sounds. Inside, maybe 8 people. Musicians mostly. Some sitting on the floor. Some leaning against walls. A few empty bottles. Cigarette smoke hanging in the air like fog. It wasn't a party. Not exactly. More like an accidental gathering. The kind that happens when musicians finish late-night sessions and nobody wants to go home yet. Jimi Hendrix sat cross-legged on the wooden floor near the window. He'd been quiet most of the night. Listening. Watching. His Stratocaster leaned against the wall beside him, unplugged, silent. Bob Dylan sat in a wooden chair across the room. Talking. He'd been talking for 20 minutes about acoustic versus electric, about authenticity, about what it meant to strip everything down to just voice and guitar. He had opinions. Strong ones. The kind that came from someone who'd already changed music once and was trying to figure out how to do it again. Electric is easy, Dylan said, gesturing with the acoustic guitar he'd been holding. You plug in, turn up the volume, let the distortion do half the work. But acoustic. He tapped the body of the guitar. Acoustic tells the truth. There's nowhere to hide. Every mistake, every hesitation, it's all there. A few people nodded. Someone murmured agreement. Dylan looked across the room at Hendrix. You ever play acoustic, Jimmy? Hendrix didn't answer immediately. He was looking out the window at the falling snow, his profile caught in the dim light from the street lamp outside. Sometimes, Hendrix said quietly. You should try it more, Dylan said. Not unkindly, but with that edge of challenge he carried. Might teach you something about what you're really saying when you play. The room got quieter. Not uncomfortable exactly, but shifted. Everyone understood they were witnessing something. Dylan challenging Hendrix. The folk poet versus the electric shaman. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He turned his head from the window. Looked at Dylan. His expression didn't change. No anger. No defensiveness. Just that steady gaze that seemed to see through surfaces. You want me to play acoustic? Hendrix asked. Dylan held out his guitar. Yeah. Show me what you got without all that amplification. Someone in the room shifted nervously. This felt like more than a friendly jam. This felt like Dylan drawing a line, saying electric guitar was somehow less than, was easier, was hiding something. Hendrix stood up slowly. Walked across the room. Took the acoustic guitar from Dylan's hands. His fingers ran along the neck, checking the tuning with quick, precise movements. He didn't sit back down. Just stood there, holding the guitar, looking at it like he was having a private conversation with the wood. What do you want to hear? Hendrix asked. Anything, Dylan said. Something true. Hendrix nodded. He sat down on the floor again, this time in the center of the room. Everyone was watching now. The conversations had stopped. Even the people who'd been half paying attention were focused. Hendrix positioned the acoustic guitar across his lap. His fingers found the strings. And then he did something no one expected. He played nothing. For 15 seconds, Jimi Hendrix sat with his hands on the guitar and made no sound at all. He was listening. To the room. To the silence. To something beyond what anyone else could hear. Dylan leaned forward slightly in his chair. Waiting. And then Hendrix began. Not a song anyone recognized. Not a cover. Not a showpiece. Just notes. Slow notes. Impossibly slow. Each one given space to breathe, to decay completely before the next one arrived. His right hand barely moving. His left hand pressing the strings with surgical precision. The sound filled the room, but it didn't dominate. It was like Hendrix was pulling the music out of the air rather than imposing it. Each note was a question. Each silence was an answer. Dylan's expression began to change. The confident challenge in his posture started to collapse. His hands, which had been clasped casually, tightened. His mouth, which had been ready with the next comment, went slack. Because what Jimi Hendrix was playing wasn't technical mastery. It wasn't speed. It wasn't showmanship. It was truth. Every note mattered. Every space between notes mattered more. The guitar wasn't amplifying anything. It wasn't hiding anything. It was revealing. Each sound Hendrix created said something about loneliness, about beauty, about the weight of being alive and trying to say something real. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. He closed his eyes. Not for effect. Not for performance. He closed his eyes because he was somewhere else. The room disappeared for him. Dylan disappeared. The challenge disappeared. There was only the guitar and whatever he was listening to inside himself. His fingers moved across the frets with impossible gentleness. No aggression. No attack. Just touch. The acoustic guitar responded like it was grateful to finally be played this way, like it had been waiting its whole existence for someone to understand what it could say without screaming. Dylan sat completely still. His entire body had gone rigid. He was gripping the arms of his chair now, knuckles white. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd expected Hendrix to try to prove something. To show off. To maybe fumble a bit on an instrument he clearly didn't play as often. Instead, Hendrix was teaching him something. The melody, if you could even call it a melody, kept shifting. Modal. Haunting. Sometimes it sounded like blues. Sometimes like folk. Sometimes like nothing that had a name. Hendrix would play 3 notes, then pause for 5 seconds. The pause was part of the music. The breath was part of the statement. One of the people sitting on the floor, a session guitarist who'd played on dozens of records, put his face in his hands. Not crying, exactly, but overcome. He would later say it was the first time he'd ever felt ashamed of how much noise he'd been making with his own playing. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. Hendrix played for 7 minutes. Maybe 8. Time had stopped meaning anything measurable. When he finished. And the finish was just him letting the final note decay into complete silence rather than any dramatic ending. Nobody moved. The silence that followed was heavier than the music. Hendrix opened his eyes slowly. Looked down at the guitar. Ran his thumb across the strings one more time without pressing any frets, just the open strings humming quietly. Then he stood up and walked back across the room to hand the guitar to Dylan. Dylan took it with both hands. He looked down at the instrument like he'd never seen it before. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" Dylan asked. His voice was different. Smaller. The challenge was gone. In its place was something like humility. "I didn't learn it," Hendrix said quietly, sitting back down near the window. "I just listened to what the guitar wanted to say." Dylan set the guitar down carefully against the wall. He didn't try to play it. He couldn't. Not after that. Anything he played now would sound like he'd missed the point. "I was wrong," Dylan said. It took effort to say it. Bob Dylan didn't admit being wrong easily. "It's not about acoustic or electric. It's about..." He trailed off. He didn't have the words. "It's about being quiet enough to hear," Hendrix said, looking out the window again at the snow. "The volume doesn't matter. The guitar doesn't matter. What matters is whether you're listening or just making noise." The room stayed silent for another minute. Then someone stood up to leave. Then another. The gathering was over. Whatever had been happening before Hendrix played couldn't continue. It would have felt disrespectful. Dylan stood up last. He walked over to where Hendrix sat by the window. "Thank you," Dylan said. Hendrix looked up at him. Nodded once. No smile. No false modesty. Just acknowledgement. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. Bob Dylan left that apartment and went home. He didn't write about it. Didn't talk about it publicly. But the people who knew him said something changed after that night. His next album would be quieter. More space. Less need to fill every moment with words or sound. Years later, when Jimi Hendrix died, Dylan was asked to comment. He declined most interviews. But he told one reporter something cryptic. "Jimmy taught me that silence is louder than I ever knew." He played more in the spaces than most people play in their whole career. The acoustic guitar Dylan had handed to Hendrix that night stayed in his apartment for 3 years. He couldn't bring himself to play it. Finally, he gave it away to a music student in Brooklyn. Told her, "This guitar heard something I wasn't ready to play. Maybe you'll be ready." The session guitarist who'd put his face in his hands during Hendrix's playing quit doing studio work 6 months later. Started teaching instead. Would tell his students, "I heard Jimi Hendrix play acoustic once, and I realized I'd been playing guitar for 10 years without ever actually listening." For Hendrix, that night was just Tuesday. Just another room. Another moment of letting the music speak through him rather than at someone. He didn't collect the story. Didn't weaponize it. Didn't even bring it up in interviews. But the people who were there never forgot. They'd reference it in coded ways. "Remember that night in February? The acoustic moment. When Jimmy shut the whole room down without turning anything on." Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The lesson wasn't about acoustic versus electric. It never was. The lesson was about ego. About the difference between playing to prove something and playing to say something. About understanding that mastery isn't volume or speed or technical complexity. Mastery is knowing when to be quiet. When to let space speak. When to trust that a single note, played with intention, can say more than 1,000 notes played to impress. Bob Dylan learned that lesson on a cold February night in Greenwich Village from a man who never needed to say, "I'm the best." Jimi Hendrix just picked up a guitar and let the truth be self-evident. The snow kept falling outside. The room stayed quiet long after everyone left. And somewhere, an acoustic guitar remembered what it felt like to finally be understood. 3 weeks after that night, Hendrix was back in the studio recording Electric Ladyland. A journalist asked him about his process, about how he knew when a song was finished. Hendrix thought for a long moment before answering. "Music isn't about finishing," he said. "It's about listening. Most people play what they want to say. I try to play what the silence wants to hear." The journalist didn't understand. Asked him to clarify. Hendrix just smiled. "Dylan knows what I mean." That acoustic guitar Dylan gave away to the Brooklyn student eventually made its way to a small music shop in the East Village. The owner kept it in the window with a handwritten note. "Played by Jimi Hendrix, February 1968. People would stop and stare at it. Some didn't believe the story. Others did and couldn't bring themselves to play it. A young guitarist finally bought it in 1972. Said he needed an instrument that understood what silence meant. The shop owner asked him if he knew the story. The kid nodded. "I heard Hendrix play once. Not this guitar, but I heard him. Changed everything I thought I knew about music. Sometimes the quietest moment is the loudest truth." The guitar stayed with that student for 40 years. He never became famous. Never made a record. Just taught music in a small apartment in Brooklyn, passing down what he'd learned. That volume measures decibels, but silence measures depth. When that teacher died in 2012, his students found a note taped inside the guitar's sound hole. Written in faded pencil, just 4 words. "Listen before you play." Nobody knows if Hendrix wrote it. Nobody knows if Dylan did. Or the first student. Or someone else entirely. But everyone who read it understood exactly what it meant.